Dave, thank you very much for your leadership and also your optimism and your inspiration in your concluding remarks. For those of you who are joining us this evening, we look forward to honoring Dave Cote with the 6th annual Peter G. Peterson Award for Business Statesmanship. So we look forward to seeing you this evening as well, Dave. I want to continue this theme of optimism and introduce Joe Minarik, who is our next speaker. Joe is CED's Senior Vice President and Director of Research, and I'll explain the optimism in a second, Joe. Joe has served with distinction as a member of the Bipartisan Policy Center's Debt Reduction Task Force. That is commonly referred to in the press as the Domenici-Rivlin Commission, after former Senator Pete Domenici and former OMB Director Alice Rivlin. But at CED, to keep it much shorter and simpler, we just call it the Minarik Commission, because we know who actually did the work. Now, why the optimism about Joe? He's a distinguished economist with 3 graduate degrees in economics from Yale and an undergraduate degree in economics from Georgetown. But the optimism comes from the fact that Joe is perhaps the only economist that I know of who, when he was chief economist at the Office of Management and Budget for 8 years in the Clinton administration, they ended up with a budget surplus. And then for years when he served as the chief economist for the House Budget Committee, he also worked very closely with Senator Bill Bradley on efforts to reform the federal tax code in 1986. So for Joe Minarik, it really is yes, we can, because he did it. He was there for some very important moments in our history. The last time we had a budget surplus, and the last time we had significant tax reform. So, Joe, thank you for your service, your leadership at CED, your contributions to the country, and we look forward to hearing your discussion about the dilemma of debt reduction and economic growth. Please welcome Joe Minarik.
Thank you, Charlie. Dave Cote, the bad news is you're going to have to endure a few more laudatory comments. We have an image in Washington that we sometimes use of business executives in the foxhole. Keep your head down, don't make waves, just pursue shareholder value. There's nothing wrong with pursuing shareholder value. However, if you've been watching the news lately, you probably understand that it is likely, if we continue following the path we're on right now, there's going to be a lot less shareholder value in the United States. So one of the most important things that a business executive can do at this point to protect shareholder value is to get out of the foxhole and to work to help to turn this country's public policy around. The bad news is if you do, if you're out of the foxhole, you're going to encounter a lot of people who may disagree with you in terms of your public policy recommendations, coming from the far left or the far right, who will take vigorous difference with you and make life relatively uncomfortable. The truth of the matter is that deficit reduction is doing things that you don't want to do. And many of our self-styled political leaders have not had the courage to go to the American people and tell them that they have to do some things that they don't want to do. Dave Cote has had that courage, and we all should congratulate him for making that effort. So now Dave has moved on from just point 1 in his competitiveness agenda to a discussion of the agenda, the whole agenda, 6 points. And in that, in effect, what he's been doing is he's jumping out of the public policy frying pan into a much larger fire. The fact that the competitiveness agenda that Dave talked about is important directly leads to the conclusion that it's going to be very hard. It's going to be hard in at least two respects. One of them is fairly obvious, and I'll get there in a moment. But more subtly, competitiveness, as a word, of course, comes from competition. And forgive me for getting into high-level etymology there, but one of the problems that prosperous nations always have had in history is the tendency to rest on their laurels. You can create incentives for producers to decide that rather than taking the high road and the hard road of innovating and competing to succeed, they will instead use legal devices to protect themselves from competition, to keep the new voices and the new ideas down. And when businesses resort to that kind of rent-seeking, of protection from competition, the country ceases to move ahead. I once heard Alan Greenspan speak about competition as being the motive force that makes economies grow. And he then proceeded very quickly to a footnote that, of course, he wanted competition for everybody else, but he would like to avoid it for himself. That is very much the sentiment, I think, around the country. And so when Dave gets out of the foxhole and says, now I've given you the bad news about debts and deficits, here are some other things you ought to do. And one of them is to expose yourself to competition. As I noted, he's taking on a very difficult task. Point one in Dave's competitiveness agenda is debt reduction. And that, I think, is the easiest way to explain why pursuing competitiveness at this time is going to be extremely hard. When the country is prosperous, when the federal coffers are full, which of course hasn't happened since I left the White House, but back then, when you had a lot of revenue and you had a very prosperous society, we could afford to be sloppy and to some degree to toss money at our problems, to pursue our competitiveness and other purposes. That's not the case today. Instead, we have to be much more precise, we have to be much more disciplined, and we have to therefore make a lot of difficult decisions. Dave mentioned one big issue in both debt reduction and competitiveness, and that, I think, is the simplest way to explain why this agenda is going to be difficult today. Let's consider the possibility of tax reform. If you want to have a tax code that is more focused on competitiveness and economic growth, there's a very easy way to go about it, at least simple, if not easy, and that is eliminate all of the many subsidies and incentives in the tax code, many of which don't work anyway. Take the revenue that you would have gained and use that revenue to reduce tax rates, which in a neutral way give people stronger incentives to pursue economic growth and to make the economy go. Now, you can do that in what we call a revenue neutral fashion. So you take the money that's coming in by eliminating the old-fashioned subsidies and incentives, and you reduce tax rates to give the money back. The problem with that, in terms of trying to get it to happen in Washington, is that if you reduce the taxes of someone who didn't have the use of incentives or subsidies, and you give that person a rate reduction so that person's taxes go down, somebody else's taxes have to go up in equal measure. So you necessarily have, in a deficit-neutral tax reform, winners and losers. We have learned by experience in Washington that the winners often are not actually aware of their benefits, and the losers will squawk. And in the past, we found that the squawking of the losers very often exceeds Washington's collective threshold of pain. So as a result, the reflex reaction of the political system is, well, we'll reduce the tax rate some more. and turn some of those losers into winners. Now that's fine, except that if you're starting out with an enormous budget deficit, you can't afford to lose revenue. You actually need to collect more, which means you're not pushing revenues down, you're not pushing tax rates down and turning losers into winners. You actually have to push tax rates up and turn winners into losers. Now, obviously, that doesn't go over very well under the normal circumstance. So that is one example of why it is that being resource short, as we are now, is going to make pursuing a competitiveness agenda much more difficult. But of course, if you think about it, being resource short is the reason why we need to pursue competitiveness. So we have a very important task to follow, and it is not going to be easy. Now, as Charlie suggested, Dave and we have been on similar paths in terms of finding ways to reduce the federal budget deficit, and Dave, as a member of the President's Commission, the Bowles-Simpson Commission on Fiscal Responsibility and Reform, worked with, as another member, Alice Rivlin, who was the co-chair of the Domenici-Rivlin Task Force of the Bipartisan Policy Center. We at CED put a lot of effort into helping to make that task force go, and there was a lot of exchange of ideas in two directions. But the message that we've got to convey, and Dave just did it extremely well, is to convince the American people that even though deficit reduction is doing things that we don't like to do, we have to do it. We've got to put people in the mood. We have got to lower the bar for steps that the American people will take as acceptable in these circumstances. It's going to be a very difficult task. I know that we will be working together on that for the duration. I think we can only hope that the duration isn't too long. But let me move on to some of Dave's other pillars of his competitiveness agenda. The second is energy policy. CED is forming a new subcommittee on energy policy that will be co-chaired by Fred Smith of FedEx and Mike Morris of American Electric Power. I believe that we are very much on the same wavelength, if you will pardon the pun. The important thing here is giving the United States of America a reliable supply of predictable, affordable energy, and doing it with the least possible environmental consequence. Now, this is going to be a long effort. One of the reasons why it is a long effort is that the investment assets that we have to put in place to generate energy are very long-lived. And while we're building long-lived assets to generate energy, we have to keep in mind that we live in very uncertain times in terms of geopolitics and also in terms of technology. So somehow we're going to have to make long-lived investments at the same time that we maintain flexibility. This is going to be another one of the pillars of Dave's competitiveness agenda that are going to be very difficult, to achieve. Dave's third element is free trade. Competitiveness is competition, and that includes competition in other markets and in our own market with firms overseas. Now, what that gives us is markets for our products and additional sources of cost-effective inputs for our productive processes. CED has been a strong advocate of free trade forever. We have it in our DNA, going back to our founders almost 70 years ago. We understand that if you want to export, you have to be willing to import. One of the things that CED has been trying to do on this front is to convince the Congress to put a serious effort into providing adjustment assistance for workers who are pressured in the first instance by additional competition from trade. This is one of the knottiest problems in policymaking. It is very hard for the federal government or state and local government elements to play the role of the invisible hand in providing incentives for people to train in particular skills and to move to particular places to find job opportunities. And yet somehow the federal government has got to work in that direction and try to make that process move more smoothly. It is very difficult not to over-assist and dull incentives, or to under-assist and thereby leave much of the need unmet. This is going to be one of the most difficult challenges that we are going to have going forward, and we look forward to working again with Dave on this aspect of economic policy. Number 4, math and science education. Within the last 20 years, CED has issued 2 statements on education in science and math. We have emphasized the roles of education governance, of management and technology in education. Okay. And we believe that we have made some important contributions in that direction. We have a new project that is being undertaken by a couple of our trustees in trying to make the education system more effective. Let me just close by mentioning that when I thought about what Dave had in his experience in the last year, I found myself thinking about the 19 years ago, and its time has flown, when I joined the Clinton administration and was introduced to Bob Rubin. And at the time, Bob walked up to me, and as I've learned since, he says to just about everybody to whom he's introduced, hey, I've heard a lot about you, and not all bad. And as I think about the process that Dave's gone through, what he has found is that when you take difficult positions in public policy, you can find that you encounter a lot of people who are willing to make life very unpleasant for you. I'm willing to predict that when the story of this time is told, and I hope that it's told with some measure of relief, that people will hear a lot about Dave Cote, and not all bad. And truth be told, Dave, when you think about it, even the people who disagree with you ought to be grateful. And the reason is that you have helped to start a dialogue that is respectful and constructive, in which different positions, different perspectives can be brought together to find a solution that can work for all of us. And it has to work for all of us, and it has to involve doing a lot of things that we don't like to do so that we can be, as a nation, as strong and competitive as we can and as we should be. So thanks, Dave, and look forward to working with you in the months to come.
Joe, thank you very much. I now have the pleasure of turning the program over to Jonathan Alter, who I think most of you probably know from his almost 30 years at Newsweek. He is a celebrated author, reporter, columnist, and television analyst. I don't think we actually ever met until a few weeks ago in the green room, but I reminded Jonathan, I think you wrote a review of a book I wrote some years ago, and so we finally met a few weeks ago in the MSNBC green room, and we are really pleased that you can be with us. Jonathan himself has written a number of books, including last year, The Promise, President Obama, Year 1, now out in paperback, and I think it went up to number 4 on the New York Times bestseller list, and also a great book, The Defining Moment, FDR's 100 Days and the Triumph of Hope. That was published in 2006, also a bestseller. Jonathan, the floor is yours, and thank you for being with us this afternoon. Jonathan Alter.